I was rushing down the hallway, late for class, when she stopped me with just 2 words, "Not yet." And in that moment, everything changed. I was late, again. The lecture had run longer than usual, and my backpack felt heavier than it ever had, loaded with notebooks, textbooks, and the weight of my own scattered thoughts. I navigated the familiar hallway, dodging clusters of students laughing and checking their phones, my mind rehearsing the things I had to say to my friends, the emails I needed to send, the deadlines that were creeping closer. That's when I saw her. My teacher. She was leaning casually against the lockers, a stack of papers cradled in her arms, her posture effortless yet somehow commanding, like she belonged to this hallway more than anyone else. She didn't smile, not in a teasing way or with the casual warmth of a colleague. I could see the quiet patience in her eyes, the kind that made you feel both exposed and understood at the same time. Before I could pass, she reached out a hand, gently resting it against my arm. It was light, barely there, but enough to make me stop mid-step. Her voice came softly, almost a whisper amidst the din of the hallway. "Not yet." I froze. The words were simple, ordinary even, but the way she said them carried a weight I couldn't name. My heart stuttered, a little too fast for my own comfort. I looked at her, really looked, at the subtle way the sunlight caught her hair, turning it into strands of gold, at the slight curve of her lips, the way her eyes held a quiet insistence without needing to raise her voice. The hallway sounds seemed to fade, replaced by the rhythmic thrum of my own pulse. I could feel the warmth of her hand through the thin fabric of my sleeve, the grounding pressure of her presence. For a moment, I wondered if I'd misread everything. The casual lessons, the professional distance. But no, this felt deliberate, intentional. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. The fluttering in my chest was distracting, disarming. My gaze drifted to the stack of papers in her arms, to the soft crease at the corner of her eyes that hinted at years of laughter and worry and experience. She was older, yes, but that difference only made the moment more tangible, more impossible to ignore. Then, slowly, she withdrew her hand. I exhaled without realizing I'd been holding my breath. The hallway was loud again, the students moving past me as if nothing had changed. But I felt different. Something had shifted, subtle and unnerving. A quiet recognition that this interaction was the start of something I didn't fully understand yet. As I continued down the hallway, my steps slower than before, the echo of her words lingered. "Not yet." I didn't know what she meant, and perhaps she didn't either, but the brief touch, the pause, the way she had held my attention with just a hand and a phrase, it stayed with me, a small spark of curiosity and tension that would not fade. And for the first time that day, I wanted to slow down, to notice, to feel, because something in that unexpected halt had unsettled me in the most captivating way. After that hallway encounter, I couldn't stop noticing her. Not in the obvious, awkward way a crush might make you stumble over words or glance too long, but in the quiet, persistent way that demands attention. It started with small, almost incidental details. The way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear before writing on the board, the slight crease that appeared between her brows when she focused on a student's question, the softness in her voice when she read aloud from the textbook. I found myself waiting for moments that allowed our paths to cross. Sitting in the back row, I watched her walk between desks, each step graceful and measured. Her presence seemed to alter the rhythm of the classroom, like time slowed just enough for me to notice the scent of her perfume, subtle jasmine over the faint tang of chalk and old paper. Even when she wasn't looking at me directly, I felt the magnetic pull of her awareness, the kind that makes you self-conscious and comforted all at once. Then came the moments of accidental closeness. A paper she handed back, her fingers brushing mine just long enough to leave a memory of warmth. A pen that rolled off my desk, and she stooped to pick it up, her hand hovering near mine for a second too long. Each time, I felt a jolt. Not startling, exactly, but enough to make me aware of the heartbeat in my chest, the way my palms seemed to sweat slightly, the subtle rush of anticipation. And yet, there was nothing inappropriate, nothing that crossed the boundary of teacher and student. That made it all the more intoxicating. The tension existed in the spaces between words, in the silence of shared glances, in the fleeting yet deliberate gestures. She was confident, composed, and undeniably graceful, but I glimpsed moments of quiet vulnerability that made her feel astonishingly human. I began to notice the way she observed me, too. A slight tilt of her head when I answered a question correctly, a brief nod of acknowledgement when I contributed thoughtfully in class. There was a recognition there, subtle but present, as if she saw not just what I said, but who I was, the nervous, fumbling young man trying to navigate more than just the coursework. And in those moments, a quiet dialogue emerged without words. My eyes would find hers across the room, a flicker of understanding passing between us, and I felt seen, truly seen. A connection that went beyond age, titles, or expectation, one that existed in the shared space of attention, awareness, and subtle, intentional gestures. By the end of the week, I realized I was anticipating her presence more than I expected. The hallway seemed brighter when she walked through it. Her laughter, soft and unassuming, echoed in my mind long after the class ended. And it happened one afternoon after class. Most students had left, leaving the room hushed, the faint echo of chairs scraping against the floor still lingering. I was about to pack my things and leave, but she asked me to stay. Her tone was casual, almost offhand, but there was something in the quiet insistence that made me pause. We ended up near the window, where sunlight spilled in, soft and warm, painting golden streaks across the wooden floor. She motioned toward the empty seats, and I took one across from her. I could hear the faint scratch of her pen as she flipped through papers, yet there was no rush in her movements. Everything was deliberate, measured, like she had all the time in the world, and somehow, I had been invited to share it. We started talking about ordinary things at first, the lecture, upcoming assignments, but gradually, the conversation shifted. I found myself talking about frustrations I hadn't shared with anyone, the pressure of expectations, the constant worry that I wasn't doing enough, that I wasn't enough. I could feel her listening, not just hearing, but truly listening, with a kind of calm patience that made it easy to open up. Her voice was soft, reassuring, and carefully modulated. When she spoke, it wasn't to offer answers, but to reflect understanding, to echo back my thoughts in a way that made me feel seen. At some point, she mentioned her own uncertainties, not in a way that revealed everything, but just enough to show she had her own quiet struggles. That subtle admission made her feel real, approachable, and human in a way I hadn't expected from someone I had always seen as composed, confident, and slightly untouchable. I noticed the little things about her, how the sunlight caught her hair, turning a few strands into copper threads, the faint crease at the corner of her eyes when she smiled slightly, the tilt of her head when she focused on what I was saying. And then there were the unspoken moments, her hand resting lightly on the desk near mine, the faint scent of her perfume that lingered in the warm air, the way her presence seemed to draw a gentle stillness over the room. There was a tension, subtle but undeniable, in the way our eyes met during pauses in conversation. Not a rush or a push toward anything physical, but a quiet acknowledgement that something was simmering beneath the surface. Curiosity, admiration, a mutual awareness of the fragile, unspoken connection forming between us. When it was time to leave, neither of us moved immediately. We lingered in the sunlight, caught in the stillness of a shared moment. I could feel the warmth radiating from her presence, grounding me in a way that made the outside world seem distant. That brief conversation left a mark, an awareness of trust, vulnerability, and a delicate intimacy that had begun to root itself quietly, steadily, between us. As I walked out of the classroom, my steps felt lighter, yet my mind raced with thoughts I couldn't fully name. The hallway seemed quieter, the air itself charged with possibilities, and I realized that our connection had grown beyond fleeting glances and brief touches. Something profound, subtle, and entirely human had begun, and I didn't want it to stop. I didn't fully understand the nature of our connection yet. I knew it was important, delicate, and entirely compelling. An invisible thread pulling me closer, quietly, insistently, towards something I wasn't ready to name. Even in the smallest interactions, I could feel the shift, a subtle connection forming, fragile yet undeniable, one that whispered of possibilities I couldn't ignore. It was a quiet afternoon in the library, one of those rare pockets of peace where the outside world seemed to pause. I had come to grab a book for research, But she was there too, tucked into a corner by the large windows. Sunlight pooled around her, highlighting the gentle curve of her shoulders and the way her hair fell softly around her face. I felt my chest tighten, an almost involuntary reaction to simply seeing her in this quiet, unguarded moment. We ended up at the same long table, seated across from each other by chance, or perhaps by something less random. I tried to focus on the book in front of me, but my eyes kept drifting to her. She was absorbed in her own work, flipping through pages and occasionally pausing to scribble notes. Yet every so often, her gaze would meet mine, and something unspoken would pass between us. A flicker, a hesitation, a shared acknowledgement that we were aware of more than just the books on the table. Then came the accidental touch. I reached for my pen at the same moment she did, and our fingers brushed. Just a brief, fleeting contact, but enough to send a shiver through my arm. I noticed the warmth of her hand, the subtle pressure that lingered just a fraction too long. She didn't pull away immediately. Instead, her eyes met mine, calm but attentive, as if silently testing the boundaries of what was permissible. My mind raced. I wanted to reach out again, to linger in the moment, to see if this connection, delicate and unspoken, could be acknowledged. But hesitation gripped me. The age difference, the roles we occupied, the social expectations that hovered invisibly between us, they all pressed down like a weight I couldn't ignore. I could feel my own hesitation mirrored in her expression, a subtle tightening around her eyes, a breath held just slightly longer, a pause that seemed to stretch infinitely. And yet, there was something electric in the hesitation itself. The unspoken desire, the shared tension, the delicate balance between propriety and curiosity. It was intoxicating in its quiet, almost imperceptible way. Every glance, every slight movement became charged with meaning. Her presence was a magnet, pulling me closer, and yet the invisible rules kept us apart, creating a push and pull that made the air between us tremble. We didn't speak of it. Words would have ruined the fragile moment. Instead, we simply existed in the same space, aware of each other's proximity, feeling the warmth and the tension without naming it. I noticed the faint scent of her perfume again, the way the sunlight kissed her skin, and the subtle steadiness of her breathing. It was almost unbearable, but in the most compelling way. Eventually, she returned to her notes, and I focused back on mine, yet neither of us moved completely away from the shared intensity. The moment lingered, like a quiet hum beneath the surface of reality, a memory that would remain even after we parted ways. And as I left the library, I carried with me the knowledge that our connection had deepened, not through words, but through hesitation, closeness, and the unspoken promise of something more, waiting patiently for the right time. It was late afternoon, the campus nearly deserted, the sky outside painted in soft shades of amber and rose. I had been walking back from a lecture when I noticed her sitting alone on a bench tucked under a large oak tree, her papers spread out beside her, the quiet rustle of leaves above adding a gentle rhythm to the stillness. She looked up as I approached, her eyes holding that same calm, inviting warmth I had come to recognize. She gestured for me to sit beside her, and I did, careful to respect the space between us while still wanting to be close. The bench was worn, the wood cool beneath my fingers, but the proximity to her made it feel somehow warmer. The air carried the faint scent of her perfume mingled with the crispness of the early evening, a combination that was grounding yet intoxicating. We began talking, first about ordinary things, the lingering heat of the day, an upcoming assignment. But gradually, the conversation shifted. She asked me how I was really doing, and I felt a weight in my chest loosen slightly. For the first time, I spoke of my insecurities, my fears about failing, about never measuring up, about feeling like I was always just on the edge of understanding life's complexities. She listened, not interrupting, but letting her eyes and small nods encourage me to continue. Her presence was steady, almost protective, and I noticed the way her fingers traced faint patterns on her notebook cover, the careful pauses in her speech that made each word feel considered and genuine. She shared fragments of her own uncertainties, not burdens, not confessions, but glimpses into her quiet vulnerabilities. It wasn't grand or dramatic. It was human, approachable, and profoundly moving. At some point, our hands brushed against each other on the bench, accidental but lingering just long enough for awareness to spike between us. I felt the warmth of her skin, the soft pressure, the subtle vibration of proximity that went beyond casual touch. Neither of us pulled away immediately. We simply allowed the moment to exist, letting the silence speak for us. I noticed her watching me more closely now, really watching, and I felt seen in a way I hadn't before. Not as a student, not as someone to instruct or guide, but as a person, complex, uncertain, and deserving of attention. Her presence was calming, yet charged with a gentle tension that made the air between us feel alive. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the campus, we lingered in that quiet space. No words were necessary for the understanding that had formed between us. The emotional intimacy, the trust, the unspoken connection, it was all there, delicate yet unbreakable. I realized then that our bond was no longer simply about glances or fleeting touches. It was something deeper, a slow-burning awareness of each other's inner worlds, a recognition that whatever might come in the future, this moment, this connection, was profoundly real. When we finally stood to leave, our hands brushed again, light, fleeting, yet full of meaning. I walked away feeling the warmth of her presence echoing inside me, knowing that this shared vulnerability had changed everything between us, and that it was only the beginning. It was a rainy evening, the kind where the campus streets glistened under streetlights, puddles reflecting fractured patterns of gold and white. I had been walking back from the library when I saw her huddled under the small overhang of the main building, a stack of papers clutched to her chest, her coat soaked at the edges. The rain blurred the edges of the world around us, making everything feel suspended in time. I hurried over, offering her my umbrella. She hesitated for a moment, looking up at me with those steady, perceptive eyes. There was a softness there, but also a tension, a quiet acknowledgement of something unspoken. We walked together, shoulders brushing occasionally under the umbrella, each touch electric yet restrained. The sound of rain pattering around us was rhythmic, a backdrop that made our proximity feel intimate, private, and charged. At some point, we paused near a lamppost, the golden light spilling over her hair, highlighting the faint glimmer of raindrops on the strands. The world felt impossibly still, as if everything else had dissolved into the background, leaving just the two of us suspended in that moment. She looked at me, and I could see the hesitation mirrored in her expression, this delicate tension between desire and propriety, between what was allowed and what was deeply wished for. Our hands brushed again, this time deliberately, as if testing boundaries. I felt the warmth of her skin, the slight tremor in her fingers, and it was both grounding and disarming. Her gaze held mine longer than necessary, and I realized she was aware of every subtle shift, the hitch of my breath, the quickened pulse, the tiny ways I leaned slightly closer without intending to. Words felt unnecessary. The tension was palpable in the silence, in the lingering touches, in the way we shifted under the umbrella to share warmth without speaking. Her presence was a quiet storm, drawing me in, making the heartache of restraint feel almost sweet. I wanted to reach for her, to let the moment unfold, but there was a shared understanding that this was still not yet, that the timing, the circumstances, and the delicate balance of respect and desire demanded patience. The rain fell harder, creating a cocoon around us. She rested her hand lightly on my arm, her fingers brushing against the sleeve, and I felt an intimacy deeper than any words could convey. Our closeness, the quiet acknowledgement of what we both wanted but couldn't name aloud, made my chest ache with longing. Every glance, every subtle movement, every heartbeat in that shared space was electric with emotion. Eventually, the rain eased, and we walked back toward the main building, our steps synchronized, our touches lingering just long enough to leave a trace of warmth. The world outside had returned, but the quiet storm between us remained, suspended and potent, waiting for the right time to fully blossom. That night, I realized that the tension between us, the anticipation, the restraint, the silent acknowledgement of longing, was no longer just a fleeting spark. It was a steady flame, quietly burning, growing stronger with each shared glance, each brush of fingers, each heartbeat we allowed ourselves to feel in the presence of the other. By the time the semester drew to a close, the rhythm between us had shifted into something quiet, steady, and undeniable. The glances, the subtle touches, the fleeting brushes of hands, they had grown familiar, comforting, like a private language only we understood. The hallway where she had first stopped me with those two words, "Not yet," now felt different, charged with memory, anticipation, and a gentle warmth that lingered long after either of us had passed through. One late afternoon, I found her in the corner of the library, tucked into the sunlight that streamed through the tall windows. Papers and books were scattered around her, but she looked up and smiled as I approached, that same patient, inviting smile that had drawn me in from the very beginning. She gestured for me to sit beside her, and I did, careful to let the space between us be comfortable yet intimate. We talked, of course, about coursework, deadlines, and plans for the break, but beneath the words was the quiet rhythm of shared understanding. I could feel her presence beside me, warm, steady, reassuring, like a gentle pulse that matched my own. There was no rush, no urgency, just the soft cadence of proximity, of closeness allowed and cherished. Her hand brushed mine as we exchanged notes, light and fleeting, yet it sent a familiar warmth through me. I didn't pull away, she didn't either. Instead, we let the contact linger, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between us. The subtle brush of her fingers against mine carried all the words we hadn't said, all the feelings we had nurtured in quiet moments. I noticed the little things again, the way her hair caught the sunlight, the faint crease at the corner of her eyes when she smiled, the gentle cadence of her voice when she spoke. Everything about her presence felt intentional, grounded, and profoundly comforting. I realized that over the weeks and months, our connection had become something deeper than fleeting attraction or simple curiosity. It was trust, affection, and a quiet intimacy that didn't need to be defined to be real. When our conversation ended, we stood together, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Our eyes met, and there was no hesitation, only warmth, understanding, and the unspoken promise of more to come. She reached up, brushing a stray strand of hair from my forehead, her fingers lingering just slightly against my skin. It was simple, ordinary even, but it carried a weight of care, tenderness, and quiet joy that made the world outside fade. As I walked away from the library that day, I felt the echo of her presence with me, steady, grounding, and profoundly comforting. The hallway, the classroom, the library, they were no longer just spaces of routine. They were shared landscapes of memory, moments, and connection. The spark that had begun with a simple "not yet" had grown into something enduring, gentle, and true, a slow-burning affection that needed no declaration, only presence, care, and understanding. And for the first time, I understood that the waiting, the subtle tension, and the careful, patient unfolding of our connection had been worth it. Everything between us, the glances, the touches, the quiet confessions, had led to this. A warm, satisfying closeness, built on trust, respect, and a delicate intimacy that would remain, quietly, beautifully, and completely ours.